Look around you for a moment. Every street looks free, every screen promises choice, every life appears self-made. But what if the freedom you feel is only a story you've been taught to believe? Imagine a cage so vast you can't see its bars, a cage built of habits, hidden desires, and invisible rules. You wake up, you work, you scroll, you buy, and yet something inside you whispers, "This isn't really mine." What if that whisper is right? What if the life you're living isn't freedom at all, but captivity disguised as comfort? Imagine waking up one morning to find that the world around you hasn't changed at all. Your phone is still on the nightstand, the traffic still hums outside, your job still waits for you, but something in you feels unbearably different. The air seems heavier, as if it's laced with a quiet, suffocating weight you've never noticed before. You step outside and realize every person you pass on the street walks with the same subtle slump, the same vacant glow behind their eyes. It's as though an invisible hand has been pressing down on everyone, sculpting their choices, their dreams, even their posture. You sense it in the small talk, in the polite smiles, in the endless scrolling of glowing screens. The whole world looks free, yet somehow it feels like a prison you can't name. You've always believed freedom was a birthright, that as long as you could choose your career, your relationships, and your hobbies, you were free. But what if choice itself has become an illusion? What if the menu of options you're given has already been predetermined, not by a dictator in uniform, but by algorithms, cultural narratives, and unspoken rules you absorbed without even realizing it? We are told we are autonomous, yet how much of what you desire is truly yours, and how much was seeded in you by forces you've never met? Picture a bird born in a cage so vast it can't see the bars. It flies, it perches, it eats, it mates, all within that space, believing the sky itself belongs to it. Only when it hits the invisible ceiling does it realize its wings were always clipped. Are you any different? You scroll through endless possibilities on your phone, pick between countless brands and call it freedom. But if every option leads back to the same quiet despair, was it freedom at all, or simply the illusion of flight? Think of the last major decision you made, the career path, the partner, the city you moved to. Did you choose them, or did the currents of expectation, advertising, and subtle peer pressure sweep you there? When you post online, whose voice do you speak with, your own or the composite echo of everything you've been taught to value? When you work late to buy things you don't have time to enjoy, whose dream are you chasing? This is the unsettling paradox of modern life. We are surrounded by freedoms that quietly enslave us. We are overfed with information yet starved of meaning. We are hyper-connected but feel more isolated than ever. We call it progress, yet the anxiety, depression, and addictions grow louder every year. If technology has solved so many of our external problems, why do we still feel trapped internally? You tell yourself you're in control. Yet why does your hand reach for the phone before you're even awake? Why does the absence of a notification make you anxious? Why do you find it easier to binge another show than to sit alone in silence? These aren't just bad habits, they are symptoms of something deeper, a system that has learned to colonize your attention, your emotions, even your sense of self. And here's the cruelest twist. The cage doesn't demand your obedience by force. It seduces you with comfort, convenience, and small doses of validation. No guards, no locks, just a velvet trap you step into willingly. The more you comply, the more invisible the bars become. You think you're choosing. In reality, you're being chosen. If this feels heavy, it's because it is. Deep down, you've felt it for years. The creeping sense that something is off, that the life you're living isn't fully yours. You've glimpsed it in the emptiness after a purchase, in the hollow victory after an achievement, in the quiet envy of someone who seems truly free. You've tried to ignore it, but the whisper keeps growing louder. Is this really freedom? Or is this a cage too subtle to see? You don't yet know how far this cage extends. You don't yet know who built it or why. But you're about to see the bars for the first time. Not the obvious ones of laws and governments, but the invisible ones woven into psychology, philosophy, and culture. This is not just a critique of society, it's a mirror held up to your own mind. And once you see it, You can't unsee it. So before you rush to the next distraction, sit with this question. If the life you're living was designed to keep you from noticing the bars, how would you even begin to escape? That is where our journey begins, into the hidden architecture of the invisible cage of modern life and why it exists in the first place. You sense the bars, but what are they made of? Not steel, not walls, but something more insidious: beliefs, instincts, and invisible scripts. Every society whispers to its children long before they can speak. This is what is normal. This is what is desirable. This is who you must become. By the time you're old enough to question it, you've already internalized it. The invisible cage begins as a story you don't even know you're telling yourself. Carl Jung called these unconscious inheritances archetypes and the collective unconscious. He warned that what we do not make conscious will rule our lives, and we will call it fate. Most people mistake their inherited drives for personal choice, your ambition, your sense of beauty, your definition of success. These didn't arise in a vacuum. They were seeded by your culture, your parents, your algorithms, your traumas. When you chase them without reflection, you become a marionette whose strings are pulled by ghosts. Friedrich Nietzsche saw it too. In his time, he watched Europe drift into a moral vacuum after the death of traditional religion. People celebrated their freedom from old dogmas, yet, as he predicted, they rushed to fill the void with new idols: nationalism, consumerism, blind faith in progress. Without an examined will, freedom mutates into another form of bondage. He asked, "What does your conscience say?" "You shall become the person you are." But how can you become yourself when you don't yet know which parts of you are authentic and which are implants? Arthur Schopenhauer was even darker. He argued that beneath all our pretenses, we are driven by a blind, ceaseless will, an endless striving that knows no satisfaction. The hunger to possess, to be admired, to dominate, to belong. It never ends because it isn't rational. It's the engine of life itself. In modern society, that will is not only left unchecked but weaponized. Corporations study your dopamine responses more closely than you study your own soul. The result is a system that feeds on your restlessness, monetizes your insecurities, and calls it normal. Aldous Huxley, writing decades later, warned of a future where oppression would come not through pain but through pleasure, where people would be so flooded with entertainment, narcotics, and trivial distractions that they'd stop caring about truth. In Brave New World, citizens aren't coerced, they're sedated with comfort. They trade their agency for ease and call it happiness. Does that sound familiar? The glow of your screen, the endless notifications, the curated feeds, they're not neutral tools, they're soma for the digital age. And then there is Gia and Paul Sartre, who spoke of bad faith, our tendency to flee from the anxiety of freedom by pretending we're just playing roles we didn't choose. We say, "I have no choice," when in fact, we're terrified of the responsibility that comes with choice. In this way, we collude with the cage. We accept the script because improvising would mean confronting the abyss. This is the hidden problem of modern life. The bars are partly external, but the lock is internal. Culture shapes your desires, yes, but you also prefer the safety of the script. You feel the tug of the algorithm, but you click anyway. You sense the falseness of the race, but you keep running. Why? Because questioning the script would mean dismantling the self you've spent decades building. Because freedom without a guidebook feels like vertigo. Psychology reinforces this pattern. Cognitive biases like status quo bias and social proof keep you aligned with the herd. Neurologically, the brain's reward circuitry makes novelty, approval, and certainty addictive. The moment you step out of line, you feel real withdrawal, loneliness, doubt, fear of missing out. The cage isn't just a metaphor, it's etched into your nervous system. Look closely at your day. The commute, the meetings, the scrolling, the shopping, each behavior seems trivial, but together they form a ritual of distraction, a ritual of obedience. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls ours a society of performance, where we are no longer forced laborers, but voluntary self-exploiters. We burn out not because someone whips us, but because we whip ourselves, internalizing the demand to optimize every moment. The cage has no warden because we have become the warden. This is why the invisible cage persists. It's not a conspiracy with a mastermind at the top. It's a self-perpetuating system of desire and fear, built over centuries, refined by psychology, and now turbocharged by technology. You were born into it, the way fish are born into water. It teaches you to equate consumption with freedom, attention with love, productivity with worth. It makes rebellion look not only dangerous, but irrational. You might feel a flash of anger reading this. If I'm trapped, who is to blame? But be careful. Anger is another script, another way the system maintains itself by directing your frustration outward instead of inward. The deeper truth is more uncomfortable. The cage is sustained by your participation. This doesn't mean it's your fault. It means your liberation begins not by toppling an external enemy, but by exposing an internal contract you never consciously signed. And yet, you're not alone in this. Every thinker we've invoked, Jung, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Huxley, Sartre, was pointing to the same reality. Humans can live their entire lives asleep inside an invisible cage, but they also believed in their own way that awakening is possible. It begins with seeing the bars, naming them, feeling their texture against your skin. Only then can you decide what is truly yours and what was smuggled into your soul by others. You are standing at the edge of this realization now. Perhaps for the first time, you sense not just vague dissatisfaction, but a clear outline of the trap. That outline is painful to see because it erodes the comforting myth that you were always free. But it also opens a door. If you can see the architecture of the cage, you can also imagine its exit. In the next stage, we will explore what happens when you continue to live inside this invisible cage without knowing it, the hidden consequences that shape not only your private life, but entire societies. Because until you grasp the full cost of your invisible captivity, you won't feel the urgency to break free. You can sense the bars now, and you've glimpsed their roots. But the real power of an invisible cage lies not in its structure, but in its effects. A cage you can see can be escaped. A cage you can't see becomes the air you breathe. It's gray. Eater's trick is making captivity feel like normal life. The first consequence is subtle. You stop asking questions. At some point, curiosity shrivels under the weight of routine. You go to school, get a job, pay your bills, fill your downtime with digital noise. You may feel restless, but the restlessness becomes background hum, like a city's constant traffic. You stop imagining that life could be different. This is the death of possibility, and it rarely looks dramatic. It looks like scrolling, like polite small talk, like "I'm fine" when you're not. Psychologists call this learned helplessness, the state in which an organism stops trying to escape even when escape becomes possible. Humans do it with their own minds. You tried speaking up once and got mocked, so you stopped. You tried a creative project and failed, so you never tried again. You accepted the job you didn't want because it was realistic. Each small surrender becomes a bar in your cage. The second consequence is identity shrinkage. In order to fit into the cage, you pare yourself down. You show only the parts that get approval. You adopt tastes that seem acceptable, opinions that won't offend, habits that signal belonging. Over time, the mask you wear fuses with your skin. Jung warned that the persona we present to the world can become a substitute for the true self. When that happens, even solitude feels crowded because you can no longer find the original you beneath the layers. The third consequence is a quiet epidemic of despair. Look around. Rising anxiety, depression, addiction, self-harm. These are not isolated failures of individual willpower. They are the predictable outcome of a society that feeds the body while starving the soul. Schopenhauer wrote that life is a pendulum swinging between pain and boredom. Modern life promises to eliminate both, but ends up amplifying them. Pain in the form of hidden stress, boredom in the form of hollow entertainment. The result is a low-grade existential sickness you can't name, but always feel. Think of your nervous system. Every notification, every like, every little red dot trains your brain to crave the next hit of validation. Over time, your ability to tolerate stillness erodes. Silence feels threatening. Boredom feels unbearable. This isn't just preference, it's rewiring. Your dopamine pathways become like ruts in a road. steering you back to the same loops even when you know they're making you miserable. You start mistaking stimulation for meaning. Meanwhile, on the societal level, the cage replicates itself in institutions. Workplaces design incentives around constant availability. News cycles reward outrage over nuance. Education trains compliance rather than curiosity. Even movements that claim to be rebellious often use the same metrics: followers, clicks, brand partnerships that keep the cage profitable. The system doesn't need to suppress dissent because it has learned how to monetize it. Another unseen consequence is that your imagination of freedom itself becomes colonized. When you think, "I want to be free," you picture consumption without limits, travel without end, a perfectly optimized life. But those fantasies are also products of the cage. They keep you chasing symbols of freedom instead of its substance. You buy experiences instead of facing the deeper question: what would it mean to live a life that is truly your own? Perhaps the most haunting consequence is intergenerational. Children watch adults modeling compliance disguised as choice. They inherit not only your genetic makeup, but your unspoken fears. They learn to self-censor before they even understand what they're censoring. In this way, the cage renews itself without a single law or whip, just through imitation and inertia. You may think, but isn't this just life? Isn't some level of conformity inevitable? Yes, but there's a difference between necessary social coordination and unexamined captivity. Every society imposes limits, but when limits become invisible, they stop being limits and become reality. And when reality itself feels unalterable, freedom dies not with a bang, but a sigh. This is why the cage persists even as you recognize it. Knowing the bars exist doesn't dissolve them. In fact, the first glimpse often feels worse. You feel angry, then hopeless, then numb. You try small acts of rebellion, delete the app, take a trip, quit a job, but the structure reasserts itself. This is not a sign of failure. It's a sign you're finally seeing how deep the roots go. The invisible cage shapes not just your choices, but your perception of what choices exist. It filters what you notice, what you desire, what you believe is possible. In psychological terms, it acts like a frame that determines the picture you can see. Break the frame and a larger world appears. But until you do, you will keep rearranging the furniture inside the same small room and call it change. This is the hidden cost of unfreedom. It doesn't just steal your time or money, it steals your vision. It robs you of the capacity to imagine yourself differently. And without imagination, there can be no transformation. You can't escape a cage. You can't conceive of leaving. The good news, if you can call it that, is that once you feel the full weight of these consequences, the hunger for real freedom grows. Dissatisfaction stops being a vague ache and becomes a clear signal. You start noticing the cracks, the inconsistencies, the tiny spaces where your authentic self still breathes. Those spaces are the beginning of your rebellion. And that is where we turn next. Because if the invisible cage is sustained by unconscious participation, then awakening is an act of refusal. Not a violent uprising, but a quiet, radical shift in perception. You cannot topple an algorithm with rage, but you can starve it of your unexamined attention. You cannot dismantle culture overnight, but you can dismantle its hold on your mind. In the next section, we'll step into this rebellion. How to break free from the invisible cage. Not by running away, but by transforming the way you see, choose, and live. Freedom from the invisible cage doesn't begin with running away. It begins with turning inward. The bars aren't only out there, they're internalized expectations, reflexes, and beliefs. To rebel is not first to smash, but to see. Most people try to escape by changing jobs, partners, cities. But if the same invisible patterns live inside you, they'll rebuild the cage wherever you go. The true rebellion is subtler and far more radical, a shift in perception. Start with awareness. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That isn't a metaphor, it's a practice. Begin observing your own impulses as if they belong to a stranger. When you reach for your phone, pause. When you feel the compulsion to perform, to please, to buy, pause. Ask, whose desire is this? Where did it come from? Not every answer will be clear, but the act of questioning begins to dissolve the spell. Second, reclaim your attention. Attention is the lifeblood of the cage. Algorithms feed on it, brands compete for it, even your own ego demands it. When you direct it consciously, you weaken the cage's power. Try small acts of digital fasting. Turn off notifications. Schedule intentional moments of silence. These aren't self-help gimmicks. They're acts of sovereignty. Each time you withdraw your automatic attention, you're cutting a thread of the invisible net. Third, embrace solitude. Sartre said we flee from freedom because it confronts us with nothingness. That's why we fill every gap with noise. But solitude is the training ground for freedom. It's in the quiet, uncomfortable moments that your authentic voice begins to surface, the one drowned out by the collective chatter. You don't have to retreat to a monastery. Begin with 5 minutes of silence each. Morning. Sit with the urge to escape. Let the discomfort wash over you. That discomfort is your soul stretching after years of confinement. Fourth, experiment with voluntary friction. The cage thrives on convenience. Everything is one click away, one tap, one swipe. This ease is pleasant but anesthetizing. Choose occasionally to do things the hard way, not as masochism but as training. Walk instead of drive, cook instead of order, write by hand instead of typing. These small acts sharpen your agency and remind you that effort can be a source of meaning, not just a barrier to pleasure. Nietzsche called this becoming who you are through self-overcoming. Fifth, audit your values. Ask yourself brutally, what do I call success, happiness, love? Trace each definition back to its origin. Did you choose it or was it given to you? This exercise is uncomfortable because it can collapse your entire map of meaning. But it's also liberating. You may discover that the life you've been striving for isn't one you actually want. That realization, though painful, is a door to authenticity. Sixth, practice micro-rebellions. You don't need to burn down your life overnight. Begin with small refusals. Decline an obligation you accepted only out of guilt. Express an opinion you usually hide. Spend a day without posting anything online. These acts seem trivial, but they're like cracks in a dam. Each one strengthens the muscle of autonomy. Viktor Frankl, who survived concentration camps, wrote that even in the most constrained circumstances, the last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude. In less extreme conditions, you have far more leverage than you think. Seventh, find communities of awake people. The cage isolates you to keep you compliant, but authentic connection is a counterforce. Seek those who are also questioning, experimenting, dismantling. Not echo chambers of cynicism, but circles of mutual courage. Share your insights, your fears, your small victories. Rebellion is contagious, seeing another person. And live by a self-chosen script gives you permission to do the same. Eighth, create rather than consume. The cage makes you a passive participant, a scroller, a buyer, an observer. Creation flips the dynamic. When you write, paint, build, plant, or simply craft a meal, you're asserting that your role is not just to ingest what others produce, but to generate something from within. Creation is a declaration. I am more than an algorithm's data point. Notice that none of these steps are glamorous. They won't get you viral applause. They're quiet, deliberate, often invisible. But that's the point. The cage's power lies in unconscious habits. Your rebellion must begin in the same micro level, but in reverse. Conscious habits that slowly rewire your inner architecture. Over time, the invisible bars lose their hold because you've stopped leaning on them. This kind of rebellion will look strange to others. Some will mock you, some will try to lure you back with the old comforts, but if you persist, you'll begin to feel something rare, a sense of self-authorship. Not total freedom, no human has that, but enough sovereignty to know your choices are truly yours. Nietzsche spoke of the free spirit as one who has the right to promise, to say, "This is who I am," and act from that ground. That is the prize of rebellion. And here's the paradox. As you reclaim your agency, the external world may not change much. The same jobs, screens, and cities exist, but your relationship to them transforms. What once felt like a suffocating cage becomes a navigable landscape. You stop expecting the system to define you and begin defining yourself within or beyond it. You move from reacting to creating, from compulsively consuming to selectively engaging. This isn't about perfection. You will still get caught in the loops. You will still feel the pull of the bars, but each time you notice and return to conscious choice, you weaken the cage's hold. Liberation is not a single event, but a practice of seeing, pausing, choosing. And as you practice, something profound begins to happen. The despair that once weighed you down turns into fuel. The boredom that once numbed you becomes space. The cage, which once felt like an unbreakable reality, begins to reveal itself as a construct, and constructs can be redesigned. That realization sets the stage for the deepest shift of all, the ultimate truth hidden beneath this entire journey. It's not merely about escaping a cage, but about discovering who you are without it. In the final section, we'll uncover that truth, the insight so powerful that your struggles with the invisible cage suddenly make sense, and your path forward becomes clear. You've seen the bars, traced their roots, felt their consequences, and begun the first acts of rebellion. But there is a truth deeper than all of this, one that does not merely explain the cage, but dissolves it from the inside. It begins with a question. Who would you be without the story of the cage? This is not an invitation to denial. It is an invitation to step beyond even the frame of captivity and freedom to a vantage point where you see that both are roles inside a larger play. For as long as you define yourself as trapped, you remain bound to the trap. Even your rebellion can become another identity, another script. The final, most radical freedom is not only to break the cage, but to stop needing the cage to define you. This is where ancient mystics and modern existentialists converge. Sartre insisted that existence precedes essence. You are not a fixed thing, you are a continual act of becoming. Buddhism taught that the self you are defending is not a static entity, but a flow of perceptions and habits. Even Jung hinted at this when he wrote of the self as something larger than the ego's persona. The insight is unsettling but liberating. Your authentic being is not an object to be discovered, but a living process to be enacted. When you see this, a quiet but seismic shift happens. You realize the cage was never entirely outside you, but it was never entirely inside you either. It was a dance between systems and self, between narratives and choices. And dances can be changed mid-step. This is not just philosophy. It is a lived experience. Think of the times you felt most alive, in love, in creation, in awe. In those moments you were not calculating your performance or scanning for approval. You were simply being, and that being spilled naturally into doing. There was no cage to escape, because there was no self watching itself behind bars. There was only the moment, full and direct. The ultimate realization is that freedom is not a place you reach, but a way you relate. It is not the absence of constraints, but the presence of conscious participation. You are always embedded in conditions, society, biology, history. But you can meet those conditions from a posture of authorship rather than reflex. When you do, even limitations become material for your art. Nietzsche called this amor fati, the love of one's fate. Not as resignation, but as mastery. The ability to affirm life exactly as it is and still create from it. This is why the deepest rebels of history were not merely destroyers, but creators. They didn't just exit systems, they reimagined them. They turned their wounds into wisdom, their constraints into symbols, their solitude into service. Viktor Frankl, in The Horror of the Camps, discovered that meaning is not handed to you but made by you. That is why even in a literal cage he could write, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Here lies your final key. Freedom is not the opposite of the cage. Freedom is the capacity to meet any cage, visible or invisible, with consciousness, to refuse unconscious participation, and to act from the soul. Still point within you that no algorithm can map. This is not a metaphorical still point. It's a practice. It's the breath before the impulse, the pause before the click, the choice to create rather than consume, the willingness to sit in discomfort until your authentic response emerges. When you live from that place, the invisible cage begins to lose its power, not because society has changed overnight, but because you are no longer defined by its scripts. You may still work, post, buy, interact, but you do so as a conscious agent, not a reflexive captive. And the more you act from this inner ground, the more the outer world subtly rearranges around you. You start attracting different experiences, different people, different opportunities, not because you forced them, but because you stopped unconsciously feeding the old patterns. There is a cost to this freedom. You will feel more exposed. Without the familiar scripts, there is no ready-made identity to hide behind. Others may not understand. Some will call you selfish, naive, or strange. But there is also a profound gain, the return of your own aliveness. You begin to experience life not as a checklist, but as a field of possibility. You rediscover wonder. You recover your capacity to imagine. At this point, you may ask, what should I do now? There is no single prescription. The point is not to trade one program for another, but to begin experimenting from a place of awareness. Keep questioning your desires. Keep reclaiming your attention. Keep creating rather than merely consuming. Keep practicing the pause. Over time, these practices will knit into a new way of being, one that no invisible cage can fully contain. And perhaps most importantly, remember that this is not a solitary journey. The invisible cage is sustained by collective habits. It will be dismantled by collective awakening. Each time you act from your authentic self, you give others permission to do the same. Each time you refuse unconscious participation, you weaken the system's hold not only on you, but on everyone around you. Freedom spreads through example, not imposition. This is the final, most powerful realization. The invisible cage of modern life is real, but it is not absolute. Its bars are woven from stories, habits, and fears, and you are the storyteller. You are not just the prisoner, you are also the architect. And the moment you recognize this, you hold the blueprint in your hands. Imagine standing at the threshold of your own life, looking back at the cage you once thought was the world. You see its outlines, its mechanisms, its seductions. But you also see something else. A door that was always there, built into the same wall you once leaned against. It doesn't open outward, it opens inward. And the key has been in your pocket all along. You reach for it now, in this moment. Not someday when conditions are perfect, not after the next purchase, not after the next escape plan. Now. This is the invitation and the challenge. Stop waiting for freedom to be handed to you. Begin living as the author of your own life in this very breath. The world outside may not change overnight. The algorithms will still flash, the old narratives will still whisper, but inside you, something irreversible will have begun. A different kind of silence, a different kind of space, a different kind of self. And from that place, the invisible cage ceases to be a prison and becomes something else entirely. Raw material, a stage, a training ground, a backdrop against which you can practice the art of conscious living. Step forward. The bars are only real if you hold on to them.